Okay, good afternoon everyone. For those who do not know me, I'm Jeff Sangerman. I'm Head of Modernisation and Strategic Planning for the Army. Hello sir, how are you? Tough audience. One of the challenges that I've had in my current appointment, and which armies have always had, is what choices do we make that will prepare us well for the challenges of the future. Every day we make decisions as a nation, as a defence organisation and as an army that in small or large respect sets the conditions for those that will come beyond us. The equipment they'll have, the structures they'll work from, the academic, the intellectual and the training basis on which we'll grow our people. So at this point in time, with the army now out of Afghanistan and looking forward to the future, how do we convince ourselves that we are making the right choices for our defence force and our land forces into the future? Well, we all know that you can't predict the future, but we do know that there are a lot of things we should be doing and should continue to do that will help to mitigate those risks and to improve the options that our future forces will have. Well, at this point in time, we are confronted with as long a list, if not longer, of challenges and choices that will need to be made about the future. And guess what? We can't afford them all. We can't do them all. We know the future will be at least as dynamic as the last 50 years. We know we're not sure what our adversaries or our missions are going to be. We appreciate that it's all just not about modernisation, and that we need to remain connected to our past, to those characteristics that have served us so well in getting us here, and then viewing this journey as an ongoing series of interconnected actions and circumstances. Now, I don't think it's too bold a thing for me to say that I do believe that we are one of the best small armies of our type in the world at present, and that in recognising what might give me some justification in making such a statement, I'm drawn to reflect upon that for our small size, given the spectrum of high-end capabilities that we maintain and our historic employment of those in operational circumstances, it's a pretty powerful and compelling portfolio. But is it the right portfolio? Is it informed by the right understanding of the lessons of history, our appreciation of the evolving character of conflict and war? Are we well enough connected to the way the world is changing, what the trends are starting to speak to us in advance? Are we self-aware enough as a community that we are convinced that our rigorous internal consultations are adequate? Or are they a sexed up version of groupthink? And may they be a limitation for us? Now, over the last couple of years, the Chief of Army and others have placed significant investment building on the momentum of chiefs and staffs that have come before to ask these wider questions. And in asking these questions, we have moved away from a community that owns the entire modernisation and future land warfare process into one where we want to extend our access and consultation to a broader intellectual diaspora, which has global characteristics to it. In short, I've challenged Nick Ryan to reach out to what we believe are some of the smartest or best connected or most thoughtful people in the world on topics that we believe are relevant to us. And we are establishing an environment where we hope to better challenge existing orthodoxies, review our current approaches, enhance the diversity, the intellectual diversity of our organisation, and to think more deeply about who we are, what we look like, and how we can be more effective for the challenges of the future. Today is a first step in that direction, but a step that will gather rapid momentum. It is my great pleasure to welcome and to thank Professor Hugh Strachan for giving your time, sir, to be here today to share some of your thoughts with us. I must admit to a bias here. I've read the occasional book from you, and what I'm taken by is, in this world of good ideas and opinions, of which I will tell you there are many, how is it that you make the choices of turning those ideas into realisable outcomes? Is our mechanism for doing that the most appropriate one for the process? And sir, in your respect, what I'm really attracted to is not only your deep thoughts and your what I think is developed ability to critically think about important issues, but the clear way in which you communicate those ideas to broad audiences that I would offer to you, Team Army, we are having trouble with at the moment. We're really smart and we understand what we do, but trying to turn that into a language or to communicate those things to broader audiences, which are part of our national decision-making process, needs to improve. And so I'm very interested in taking the ideas of the brightest or the most inspirational or the most thoughtful people that we can reach out and touch, and then connect it to a responsive mechanism that actually thinks about how do we turn this into something? How do we take that baton that is an idea and deliver it as some sort of improvement for the army and for the joint force? And so this is a shared journey we're going on here. And so for those of you that wear the green that are sitting here today, I ask that you're not just here to contribute into the discussion, but also I require that you think deeply about how we interpret, harvest, and realise the potential of our ideas better and more efficiently and in a more agile, responsive fashion than is currently the case. Matched together, this can be a fantastic investment in our future. And I can think of few better people in the world to open up this new journey for the Australian Army than Professor Strachan. Sir, can I welcome you here today? And I thank you again, and I'm absolutely delighted that you could come, and I'm avidly fascinated in what you're about to say.
Thank you very much indeed. That's a hard act to live up to, or to fulfil the expectation. So let me begin by two immediately disarming statements. The first is, of course, I don't do the future, I'm a historian. And I will speak in analogies in what follows. And the second reason is the justification for doing that, which is that history is not, of course, about seeking patterns or finding repetitions or any of those things. It is about recognizing that history is about understanding change. You know, what matters most to us in the recent past? I've had two conversations already, I think, in the last 10 minutes about what happened on 9/11. It was about dealing with change. Very often when we're thinking about where has warfare gone in the last 2 or 3 decades, if it isn't 9/11, it's the end of the Cold War that becomes a crucial part of that argument. It is about change rather than about continuity, but of course the natural tendency of us as human beings, and I have to say of historians too, is to talk about continuities because it's the easy bit. It's tackling change that's the difficult bit. And even more difficult is recognizing change when it comes, what really is significant change as opposed to what is continuity. I think I'm going to answer the exam question a bit. I shall try to, because you're not the only army, of course, in the world that is confronting this problem. Indeed, most armies in the Western world, broadly defined, NATO and so on, are asking very similar questions. Let me begin with a historical example, and it's a pretty obvious one, but I think it makes the point clearly enough. On the 1st of September 1870, the Prussian army defeated the French at the Battle of Sedan. It was one of, in inverted commas, the decisive victories of history. Over 100,000 French soldiers surrendered. The Emperor Napoleon III also surrendered, of course, lost his throne on the strength of it. And the Prussian Chief of the General Staff, Helmut von Moltke, said, with the defeat of the army, with the sequel called it the annihilation of the army, of course a loaded word, the Empire of France fell. It was a classic campaign in terms of what staff colleges thought should happen in those days. It fitted the Napoleonic model. It was a short war which resulted in a decisive battle, producing, it seemed, the end of an empire and the unification of another, with the unification of Germany. And in Germany after 1871, Sedan Day was celebrated every year between 1871 and 1914. And as one generation followed another, young Germans rued the day, the fact that they hadn't been there and their boring fathers who went on banging on about it had been, and no doubt by 1914 many of them were grandfathers, and they felt they wanted to be there too. When could they find their moment of glory on the battlefield? It was, together with Sadovo, Königgrätz, whatever title we give the battle of 1866, it was the founding story of German military prowess, and it went on shaping the imaginations of German military thinkers from that day until 1945. And yet, it did not decide the outcome of the Franco-Prussian War, any more than did the next battle fought at Sedan in May 1940 decide the outcome of the Second World War. Guderian's panzers may have crossed the Meuse and may then have broken through and indeed led very quickly to the fall of France in a way that nobody had anticipated during the course of 1914-18, but the war did not end in 1940. What happened in 1870? Well, what actually happened was that the Empire of France fell, but a republic sprang from the ashes of defeat, a Council of National Defence with a general, it might be pointed out, at its head, just to show civil military relations were well organised in this republic. A Committee of National Defence was formed. France mobilised the nation for war, and resistance was protracted through until 1870. The story of French national resistance between 1870 and 71 no doubt was improved in the telling, but that's not unique to the military history of France any more than any other national myth-making story. And what was also exaggerated in the telling almost certainly were the atrocities committed by German soldiers who became frustrated with the guerrilla warfare that they encountered. The point I want to make now is that that second phase of the war did not form part of the German narrative. It didn't fit in. The need to deal with irregulars sustaining a war of national resistance was not part of German operational and strategic thinking between 1871 and 1914. And the notion that containing an insurgency was what an army should be doing was not part of the preparations or the, if you like, the intellectual thought, of which there was plenty going on in Germany between 1871 and 1914. What did happen, of course, was some sort of carryover in terms of this having been in danger of undermining the victory at Sedan. And in 1914, the German army reacted preemptively against what it perceived would be guerrilla warfare in Belgium and northern France, killing, I forget the exact numbers, but roughly 5,000 Belgian civilians and of the order of 2,000 French civilians in the opening weeks of the war. An act which horrified the civilized world and an act which formed part of the propaganda story for the Allies for the rest of the war, even up until 1917-18 when the United States entered the war. Remember Belgium became the leitmotif of Allied propaganda for the rest of the war, and arguably had a big part in shaping the peace settlement in terms of the sense of German war guilt, which wasn't just derived from how the war had broken out, but also how it was conducted. In the Second World War, German units were no better prepared for partisan warfare in Central and Eastern Europe, and in due course, when guerrilla warfare did actually develop, partisan warfare did actually develop in Western Europe and Italy and in northern France, the same story applied. In other words, the forms of war that you might now regard as more related to your experience of war form no part of the lexicon of warfare as disseminated and taught within the German army. When Germany itself needed to mobilize its peoples for irregular warfare, for last-ditch national resistance, either in 1918 or in 1945, it failed to deliver. The German army had effectively studied and pursued one form of war to the exclusion of another. It had read its own history selectively in order to support the narrative, and I wouldn't go as far as to say, and I'm not suggesting for a moment, that it lost both world wars solely because of that failing. But what I am saying is that failing is not irrelevant to the eventual failure of German strategy. And moreover, the reluctance to absorb what had happened in terms of that wider experience is extraordinary. In 1925, a veteran of the First World War, Georg Soldan, who was at that time working as a military historian in the Reichsarchiv. You remember in 1919 the German army is left without a general staff, it has no thinking body within it. It wants nonetheless, of course, to continue to study war, in particular to draw in the lessons of the First World War. And it creates in the Reichsarchiv, which is nominally a civil body charged with writing the official history of the war, essentially job opportunities for staff officers. So if Australia is ever defeated in the future, you know what careers you can look forward to. And if you're not naturally happy in working in archives, then you may not be ready to engage in serious military thought on this calculation. Georg Soldan is given this job, and one of his, here he is with an army reduced to 100,000 men, big of course, I realise by the standards of both the British and the Australian armies these days, and deprived of tanks and aircraft, which you're not, as well as of a general staff, which you're not. He wrote that because Germany, in 1925 this is, because Germany is so weak, because it cannot sustain protracted warfare, it must seek battle. I mean, there is a sort of perverse determination here not to change the thought, even when common sense would say, if Germany were to be invaded in the 1920s, the logical thing would be guerrilla warfare, war of national resistance, avoid battle, and play to the strategy of what we would see to be the strategy of the weak, rather than the strategy of the strong. Now, I've said that because it's a sort of cautionary tale. I've said it too because we think we know better. We would never do that sort of thing again. But the evidence suggests, of course, we're not very good at doing better. Just think what happened after the initial invasion of Iraq by the United States and its allies in March 2003. Very quickly, and I don't know when they were first published in Australia, but certainly in the UK, very quickly after the invasion, there were reports of guerrilla fighters. Saddam's Fedayeen were meant to be conducting a guerrilla campaign of sorts. And in fact, I remember, I was trying to remember what the date was, so I did go back and check it. I was asked by the Times in London if I would write a piece on guerrilla warfare because nobody knew anything about guerrilla warfare. And it was off the radar. So it was the end of March. So it was very soon after the invasion. I sort of went through the stuff of talking about Mao and Che Guevara and all the sort of standard stuff. And it reads pretty absurdly now, particularly when we've learned so much more. But what seems to me extraordinary was that even when that had happened, very quickly, the message came down that this was not what was going on. This was not part of the narrative. The Fedayeen were largely crushed by April 2003. But of course, as we now know, their members re-emerged in insurgent groups and provided the expertise which underpinned Sunni resistance. The parallel with Sudan is not exact, but I think it's instructive. Remember how the United States Armed Forces saw themselves in 2003. Remember how they were seen as the pioneers of the revolution in military affairs, network-centric warfare, and then, of course, transformation. Remember how every army associated with the United States was matching itself not against a potential enemy, but against their own allies. Are we fit to fight with the Americans was actually the question that concerned everybody. Not are we fit to win a war against an enemy, which might be the prime requirement. I'm overstating, of course, to make a point. But what, certainly in my experience, the British Army wanted to do, I was advising the doctrine group for the Army at the time, and I remember after TEDx 1 sitting somewhat strangely in a hotel in Oxford, in the Randolph Hotel. We didn't meet an MOD, and it became clear, I think, quite quickly why, because what we actually wanted to say to CGS was not quite what CGS wanted to hear, which was that the conclusions to be drawn from TEDx 1 weren't quite the conclusions the Army wanted to draw, which at that stage, of course, was a positive success story, and one that Mike Jackson in particular was to take away. But what, of course, we did want to reinforce, or at least what the US allies wanted to reinforce, was that they were the arm fist of the world's leading democratic power, and that they were capable of showing true operational brilliance, which in many ways they had indeed shown, in defeating the regular forces of Saddam Hussein in short order. Irregular warfare was not in the script, and indeed its very unfamiliarity was precisely why the Times asked me to write a piece about it. And that is also the second part of this story, because in 2003, after April, the references to irregular warfare disappeared off the script as fast as they had appeared. It was as though multinational force Iraq had decided that reports of guerrillas were part of a disinformation story. And I'm sure you all remember the narrative. Throughout 2004 and 2005, the United States and then the press struggled to find the words to explain what was actually going on. Was there an insurgency? It was never, there is an insurgency. The question was, are we actually dealing with an insurgency? Because if we say we are, then we're in a different place, but we don't really want to say we are because that's not a place we want to be in. And then that question that went on and on and on, which is, are we confronting a civil war? With denial that we were confronting a civil war in Iraq. We're quite happy to use the civil war phrase when we're talking about what's going on in Syria. We seem, in retrospect, extraordinarily unhappy to talk about it in relation to what was going on in Iraq. In other words, there was a denial of what did not suit the dominant and positive narrative. And as already suggested, this wasn't just an American problem. This was a problem for other armies as well. And after that meeting in the Randolph Hotel, I and the then Director General of Development and Doctrine went to see Mike Jackson to talk about what had been discussed. There was some discussion then about whether a thinking part of the army should be engaged with these issues, and whether in the course of a campaign it was time to stop and think about where we were going. And the line from him and from his successor was that it was not really possible to learn lessons while simultaneously conducting a campaign. That it was more important to get on with the job, to finish it, and then to draw your conclusions. I'm tempted to point out that the British Army, given its very poor performance between 1939 and 1941, would not have begun to get anywhere near better by 1944 and all that discussion of Normandy if it had sat around simply saying, we're doing okay, we'll worry about it when the Second World War is over. There needs to be a lesson learning process that goes on during a conflict as well as after it. By 2006-07, many of us, and I'm sure you around this table, and certainly I, and I'm sure Jeff, were attending workshops and conferences at which one particular question recurred again and again. It went something like this. We all know that one of the reasons we have got ourselves in this position is that after Vietnam, the United States failed to learn lessons. Its response, the response of the US Army had been, that was a mess. We don't want to do that again. We don't want to do a counterinsurgency campaign again. We don't want to do what we had to do in Vietnam. Instead, we want to orientate ourselves towards the sort of war which we think we're best equipped to fight, which is, of course, the fight in Europe against the Soviet invasion. That's what we must get right, and that's what we should reconstruct what was now, of course, an all-volunteer force around. Rather than assimilate and understand the lessons of Vietnam, what we should do is focus on the more comfortable narratives of conventional warfare. Now, that's obviously overdrawn because actually the special forces in the United States are doing other things that we would instantly recognize, including, of course, training and preparing other countries to be able to conduct their own counterinsurgency campaigns. But the dominant narrative became, for the American Army as for the British Army, treat conventional high-end warfare fighting as the gold standard and treat counterinsurgency and other forms of conflict as lesser order things that you can do on the back of the higher end capabilities. And that's the way it should be done. After all, in the British context, the British Army on the Rhine was essentially the body that was sustaining Northern Ireland campaign. So therefore it can be done. Those two things can be put together. So the question at these conferences in 2006-07 was, what would the US Army do when the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were over? Would they repeat the pattern of the 1980s and reject the lessons learned from Iraq and the experience that had been gained there? Or would they hang on to the lessons of war since 9/11? And of course, the tendency, and now it seems bizarre, or not bizarre, it seems a sort of, a golden moment, but the tendency in 2006-07 was to say, of course we won't forget the lessons. This time we really have learnt. And we absolutely know that to adopt a sort of exclusive view of warfare would be wrong, and we've got to be ready to accept that the sort of campaign we've just been fighting in Iraq, and of course the campaign that still had a great deal of distance to go in Afghanistan, is something that should be central to our thinking. And the wisdom and experience which have been gained in those wars and apparently embodied in Field Manual 3-24 and hallowed by success in the shape of the surge in Iraq, would be what would be carried forward. That does seem a long time ago now. If we sit here in 2014, just think of the debate that the United States is currently having and where it's got to. The revision of Field Manual 3-24 has run into considerable difficulty. There is real doubt, and you probably run this table are much better informed than I am, but the latest information I'm getting is it's going to be a pretty disappointing document that comes out as a consequence of all this. This is not to put Field Manual 3-24 on some sort of pedestal as a model, but at the very least it shows an army trying to engage with issues which it knew it had to engage with, and trying to learn in mid-campaign, which the British have been so reluctant to do, about where it should go. But what has also happened is a deep debate between those now known as the Coinistas on the one hand and those who are opposing the Coinistas on the other hand. The sort of John Nagels of this world on one side, and Gian Gentile and to some extent Doug Porch with his book on counterinsurgency on the other. And into the mix, of course, are thrown all those considerations that always prevail, always, no historian should use the word always, which very often prevail in situations where you are climbing down from a high level of mobilization and equipment and commitment to recognizing you're dealing with a post-conflict austerity budget, where of course what do you want to do? That is, you need to protect as best you can what you have against pressures to cut, against loss in the United States of presidential support, and the loss, of course, of public support for defense policy, particularly defense policy in this case, predicated on counterinsurgency and the possibility of long-term protracted conflict. What we're all being told we're not going to do is protracted campaigns of intervention committed to nation building. What follows out of that, of course, is a need for each service, and particularly knowing I'm in an army environment, I now safely say, there's no sailor or airman here, so I beg your pardon. There are one or two. The long-term need for each service, certainly for the Navy and the Air Force, and even possibly for the Army, to consolidate its equipment program. What is it that we need to make sure survives in periods of austerity? And that is the thing that will be here long after all of us have moved on, which is the kit. Some of which, and if you're talking about big ships, of course, might have a 50-year life cycle, particularly allowing for refits, which will be therefore probably driven by the demands of high-end warfare, however improbable that may be in our current defence policies and national strategy. So, as opposed to 2006-07, here in 2014, there is a much greater probability than could have been imagined 6 or 7 years ago that the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan, like the lesson of Vietnam, is that you shouldn't do this sort of war. That seems to be what we're taking away from this. And that is the case even when we are still uncertain of the outcome. Will Afghanistan be packaged as a defeat? Let me just give you another analogy, just because I'm fond of Clausewitz. In 1812, Clausewitz says, when he resigns from the Prussian army because he's so pissed off because the king has agreed to a Prussian military contingent fighting for the French, for the enemy, against the Russians in the invasion of Russia in 1812. He's so pissed off he resigns his commission and joins the Russian army. But he writes a memorandum in which he says, it is more important to fight and die than not to fight at all. And when he writes that, he assumes that by fighting for Russia he'll be on the losing side. He assumes that there is no long-term prospect of anybody being able to defeat Napoleon, to defeat France. But of course, when he judges it from the perspective of 1815, this looks a pretty wise decision to have made. He was on to a winner. It's not why he resigned his commission and joined another army, which of course was career suicide at the time. It was because he believed that he was doing the right thing. In other words, you don't actually know the outcome of a war while it's going on. And how it turns out may look very different from not only where you are when you make that judgment, but when you make that judgment. In the case of Afghanistan, I don't think we will look at it as a defeat, because all the allies that have been involved with ISAF in one form or another have already redefined so often what success in Afghanistan might look like that we can neither win it nor lose it. Because we don't really know what we're trying to achieve, it's going to be very hard to say we haven't achieved it, any more than it's going to be very hard to say what we have achieved. And indeed, as I've said, when you make that call may be as important as how you define the outcome. You think in relation to Iraq. The US declared victory twice in Iraq. First of all, of course, that memorable Bush moment in 2003, mission accomplished. And secondly, of course, after the surge, which provided the basis for American withdrawal. In other words, the definition of success was being able to bring the American army out. It looks much less like a success now in 2014. Think, too, of how Libya looks like after the NATO action in 2011. David Cameron has regarded that as a success, did regard it as a success. It gave him a great deal of confidence as a young Prime Minister that he'd used military force, it seemed, with a satisfactory outcome. It is interesting in the debate on Syria in September last year, or end of August last year, confronting Parliament, he did not once refer to Libya as a precedent for what he was trying or might be trying to do in Syria. He was not confident enough, it would seem, to use it, because, of course, it looks much less like a success from the perspective of 2013 or 2014 than it did in 2011. This point matters for the issue of lesson learning, because unequivocal victory has rarely been good for any army. It encourages complacency. It hallows existing institutions and capabilities, and it makes reform and adaptation very difficult. Unequivocal defeat can actually be extraordinarily good for you. It really does tear up the presumptions on which you are running. Not good for you in the short term, but good for you in the long run. France did actually learn from its defeat in 1870-71, just as it had learned from its defeat at the hands of Prussia in the 7 Years' War 100 years before that. The French army of the First World War, the French army of the Revolution and of Napoleon were both products of French defeats at the hands of Prussia. An army that was prepared to think, what the hell have we been doing? Why have we got it wrong? Why have we got it wrong? Can we get it right next time? The fact that the United States construed the war in Vietnam as a defeat, at least at the time, even if that defeat is now disputed, was ultimately beneficial for the army in terms of its reorganization. That is to say, it moved from having a conscript army to the all-volunteer force, and for its doctrine, because whatever I've just said about its failure to think about coin, I do think the whole maneuver warfare debate of the 1980s was, broadly speaking, a constructive and positive development. Just think of the problems that confronts the British Army when it does this sort of thing, and I might ask you whether you think the Australian Army does the same thing. Britain's problem is that it doesn't do defeat. It does get defeated, of course, but it has a number of contrivances for getting round the problem. The first is that it may lose a battle, but it then says, but of course we won the war, which is actually not a bad defence. Both the First and Second Afghan wars of the 19th century fit that model, although I have to say in the prevailing narrative in the British press they don't get that. But the retreat from Kabul in the winter of 1841-42 and poor old Dr. Bryson turning out at Jalalabad, which has been trotted out as though that were the end of the First Afghan War, when Keen's Army of Retribution, of course, came and did horrible things to Afghanistan, and Afghanistan jolly well behaved itself for the next 40 years as a consequence of that, suggests that they did actually win the war after all. So, you can get your history wrong. The second Afghan war, if I hear David Richards talk about the mistake of Maiwand once more, and of course Maiwand was a mistake, and of course it was a bad news to make sure, to find the British Army on the same ground again, because that would feed the Afghan story. But it is worth remembering that the second Afghan war also ended with Afghanistan in a pretty good and controllable place from the point of view of the British. And I've already taken the example, of course, of the opening of the years of the Second World War, where Britain was indeed defeated in almost particularly every land action, almost with the exception of 7th Armoured Division's campaign in Libya, every land action up until Alamein. And then, of course, the story is, as Australia knows perfectly well, that the war was won. The second device, of course, is to dress up your battlefield defeats as moral victories. And Britain is particularly good at this. I mean, the charge of the Light Brigade, Mons in 1914. I keep on being told we should celebrate Mons. It seems a very odd thing. In fact, we are going to celebrate Mons because that's when the BEF goes into action in 1940. It's a defeat and a retreat. It's like deciding to celebrate Dunkirk, which is the other one we're quite good at doing. It's interesting, all those three examples, we are allies of the French, and the French are the major armies, and we're the minor army, which we also, of course, write out of the script. And the third thing that the British tend to do is to dress up the wars in which it was defeated as wars which it never wanted to win in the first place. And I've just been speaking to Jeff's class this morning about Britain's campaigns of colonial withdrawal. And of course, essentially what Britain said at the very beginning of the campaigns of colonial withdrawal is, we're getting out. You give up the argument for winning the war. You just need to come out on satisfactory terms. Because Britain quickly agreed that it was getting out of the business as empire, it had conceded the political objectives almost as soon as it began the business of fighting, although that narrative did backfire spectacularly in Aden. Why do I refer to that British experience? Well, partly because I think that's the narrative we may all end up adopting for Afghanistan. The combination of tactical success and political uncertainty will be fashioned into a satisfactory outcome. Not least because, of course, I think all our armed forces, all our governments, but in that interface perhaps between governments and armed forces, have become clear that our doctrine should not talk about victory. Victory is a word that's no longer on the radar. Instead, we are talking about a situation where we're uncertain about the distinctions between war and peace. We're expecting a degree of relatively continuous fighting with indeterminate outcomes, which in itself makes things incredibly complicated for the military, who do tend, of course, quite naturally to want clear outcomes. The problem for the future, or the problems for the future, are first a presumption that we won't do long-term intervention in the immediate future, or certainly not soon, although I do wonder whether France's rather different conclusion, which is that you should do intervention in Francophone countries where you already have a sympathetic population and you make sure you don't stay in for too long, might actually be a model that may be more helpful for all of us. And secondly, that the outcome from Afghanistan and Iraq and the ways in which we construct those outcomes will not be so definitively bad that it prompts either a definitive rejection of them as a model or a determination to assimilate its lessons. And that is, have I got a few more minutes? That's what I would just like to think about. How do we do this lesson learning process? How do we set about, and I have to say one of the things about looking at your white paper of last year is there's a lot in there about lesson learning, something which is not in the public domain at all, or even in the internal domain very much for the British at the moment. It's incredibly difficult to get it right. In 1902, Britain, and Australia is of course complicit in this, and I'm not mentioning Breaker Morant here, in 1902, the South African War was won, but not as easily as anticipated, and only after a series of shocking defeats at the outset. But the effect of that war was genuinely to prompt major re-examination, a series of royal commissions, a programme of wider defence reform, which led to the creation of the Committee for Imperial Defence in 1902, a body that really brought together military and political leadership around the same table to discuss strategy in a coherent way. The creation of a general staff, and of course in due course an imperial general staff with consequences for Australia, beginning in 1904-1906, and in Britain the organisation of the territorial force in 1908. And underpinning it all, of course, the organisation of the British Expeditionary Force, the army that goes to France in 1914. But what, of course, Britain had created was an army optimised for the next Boer War, optimised for imperial expeditionary warfare, not for warfare on the continent of Europe. It did not have conscription. It had no capacity, in other words, to generate mass. Its general staff was tiny in relation to the size of army it would need by 1914, 15, 16. It had to choose whether staff officers were to stay in London and run the War Office, or whether they should be in the army in France. And of course, most staff officers worth their salt wanted to be with the army in France. The consequence that the high administration of the army was left to the so-called dugouts, who were brought out of retirement to fill the slots available. It had no experience of regular command and staff work above the divisional level, despite the fact that in European warfare in 1914, the Corps was the key operational level command. Imagine that in this day and age. And if I think how recently the British Army was still hung up on the ARC, the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, precisely because it kept Corps command skills alive within British military experience. As a result, it took more than 2 years between 1914 and 1916 for the British Army even to get to the scale required for European war. The one asset it did have was intellectual flexibility. In the decade before the first, and that's not an image we would naturally have of the British Army before 1914, in the decade before the First World War, it knew perfectly well that it had to balance two competing requirements. On the one hand, the immediacy of small-scale colonial campaigns on a recurrent basis against the other possibility, which was the remoter contingency of a major European war. In 1909, the Director of Staff Duties, a man called Douglas Haig, as it happened, wanted to optimise the British Army and its first ever doctrinal manual for that second contingency only. He wanted the Field Service Regulations, which were produced in that year, and you know far more about this than I do, but he wanted to prepare that on the basis that the army would be going to France. The then Commandant of the Staff College, Willie Robertson, who became Chief of the Imperial General Staff in 1915, opposed that. He argued, as the man who taught both of them at the Staff College in the 1890s, G.F.R. Henderson, had put it, that the British Army had to be ready for very different sorts of war in very different environments, and that therefore its doctrine could only be based on principles that could not, to quote Henderson, could only be based on principles, but could not pretend to show those principles must be treated. I wish I could read my own writing. I'll just summarise what he said, rather than try to read the quotation. That instead of having something that was optimised for one sort of war, you had to be ready for the possibility of colonial war as well. So what both Robertson and Henderson were saying is that we have to be flexible enough to be able to go one way or the other and not to be tied to one model of war only. This is why, in their judgment, the principles of war were so central. They were arguing that principles could be established, which, while not of universal application, might at least be the sorts of questions which you might in general ask of any sort of operation in which you might be engaged. Now, what's the relevance of this today? The point is that the US debate between the coinistas and their opponents is in danger of being a blind alley. The need for flexibility when addressing the question of future war means that simple solutions are almost certainly the wrong ones. And it is not a question of either coin or no coin, but of both and. The crucial question is not which model of war is right, because there is no one model of war. The crucial question is, how do you develop the flexibility, imagination, and adaptability to learn from all experience, good and bad, which is what armies can struggle to do, get the bad stories out there as well, and then be able to apply their accumulated wisdom. It means not being swamped by the last war. The natural tendency of any army coming out of any war is to privilege that war as though it was the only war. Because obviously, for you guys in this room, there have been a range of operational experiences for Australia in the last 10 years, but one or two stand out as particularly important, and the ones that you would naturally emphasise. Just as for far too long the Second World War remained the gold standard, even if it didn't reflect the practice. But equally, of course, you mustn't dismiss your own experience. I'm not suggesting that either. The task is to get a perspective on your own experience and to put it into context. But then there is a further problem, and an even more difficult one, and that is the need to develop the capability which can deliver on whatever those insights or wherever those insights may lead. And here I think there is a danger of perpetual mismatch. Logically, the more diverse the sorts of operations with which an armed force is confronted, the more varied and complex the types of equipment it will demand. Too often, since 1990, armed forces have had to use screwdrivers to hammer in nails and hammers to drive in screws. A couple of years ago, when do they come into service? I went on board the new Royal Navy Type 45 destroyer. I can't remember the first one, was HMS Daring. And the captain very proudly reeled off all the roles which his ship could perform, from disaster relief to humanitarian intervention. And it got to such a point that engaging the enemy in action in its anti-missile and anti-aircraft roles was almost the last of the things that he said this ship could do in the long list of the things that the Type 45 could do. The problem is that although a Type 45 may be able to help out with disaster relief and humanitarian intervention or evacuation, its cost and sophistication vastly exceed and are not optimized for those roles. It is optimized above all, of course, for its warfighting role. And that seems to me the challenge that any armed force has now as it comes out of the experience of protracted conflict and confronts a reduced budget. What do you do about procurement? Because what you do about procurement does actually have an effect, of course, on how you fight or how you might imagine the battlefield. Let me give you a very simple example, because you'll all have seen Zulu. The key weapon system in Zulu, apart from, of course, the assegai, is the 5.77-inch caliber Martini Henry rifle. I gather there was a wonderful sequence where Colour Sergeant Bourne, or whatever it's called, was meant to explain to a young recruit how to load and fire a Martini Henry and to get maximum effect out of it. That rifle had a 5.77-inch caliber because the round was reckoned to be sufficiently large to have a stopping power against a charging horse, as well, of course, as against a charging Zulu. But its very size meant, number one, that the average infantry soldier could only carry a small number of rounds. What that meant was that tactically, fire control became more important than fire volume, for all the appearance that Zulu creates. And the other point, of course, and I'm sure you all know this story, is that the falling breech mechanism, which I'm sure you all remember from the film, jammed in the deserts of the next war, which Britain fought in Egypt and the Sudan in 1882 and 1885. In other words, a weapon optimized for one sort of conditions did not deliver very well for another. Today, armoured vehicles designed for use, from the British point of view, for example, in Europe, become insufferably hot if deployed in the Middle East without air conditioning, a point that nobody seems to have anticipated before deployment. The intimate connection, it seems to me, between tactics and policy could not be better illustrated. No one imagines that if you have the wrong sort of equipment at the most basic level, this is actually going to prevent you from delivering in the field. But clearly it can. So 2 lessons from this. 1, an adaptable force still needs to be given regional and geographical context through policy direction if it is to maximise its effectiveness, however flexible and adaptive its intellectual capacities are. And I have to say, it's always seemed to me, reading both the 2009 and the 2013 Australian Defence White Paper, you have that benefit certainly over a national security strategy in the UK, which still talks about no reduction in global influence, which therefore gives no clear guidance as to where British Armed Forces might expect to be deployed. And secondly, the point that enhanced equipment capabilities can be, and this is really the challenge, the enemy of flexibility and adaptability of thinking. The equipment can become the master and not the servant. Consider the 2 armies that arguably responded most adaptively to the tactics and operations of the Second World War and their evolution. The first is the German army, despite its neglect of partisan war, and the second is the United States. Between 1919 and 1935, German equipment programs lagged way behind German thought, not least because of the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Germany just didn't have the equipment. The first time Guderian went in a tank was in Russia, not in Germany. And most of the exercises that involved tanks in the 1920s didn't involve tanks. They had to be imagined to be there. German soldiers had no option but to focus their efforts on intellectual activity. Ironically, over the same period, the United States Army confronted exactly the same problems, not of course because it had been defeated, but because of economic crisis, because of austerity measures. But that did not stop the United States Army avidly collecting material on the lessons of the First World War, including vast ranges of works in other languages from other participants in the war, and then actively translating those, making those available in English to their officers. Between 1927 and 1932, George C. Marshall presided over the infantry school at Fort Benning. 150 pupils and 50 of the instructors who passed through the infantry school in that period went on to become generals. His methods stressed flexibility and adaptability. To give you, and to end with, one example, one of those instructors was who didn't of course serve in the United States Army, didn't go on to become a United States general, was a German major, Adolf von Schell, who had served in Belgium and France in 1914, had served on the Eastern Front in 1915-1916, and the Carpathians in 1917, and Ukraine, relevantly enough, in 1918. And he was brought to Fort Benning by Marshall as the German exchange officer. Schell told his pupils, bringing together, if you like, this German and American experience in the interwar period, he told his pupils, in war, obscurity and confusion are normal. Late, exaggerated, or misleading information, surprise situations, and counter orders are to be expected. There seems to me no better basis for thinking about how we approach the future. And as one American officer taught by Schell put it, the German aim is to teach how, not what, to think. So it's about, in my view, asking questions rather more than it is about trying to deliver answers before you know what those questions are. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Strong. We do have a little bit of time for some questions. I think about 15 minutes, Jeff, if that's okay. So I won't say anything more. I'd like to get straight into questions and ensure everyone here has as much chance as opportunity interrogate Professor Storm before he heads off about 2:45, 3. So if I can open the floor to questions. Have we got a first question?
Sir Andrew Hocking, I'm the Director of Future Land Warfare. Obviously keen to learn from history. But what do you, given we're in a society now that we try to market ourselves positively, we try to brand ourselves positively, both in peace and in war through information operations, how much do you think that contributes to our historical inability to learn institutional lessons?
I don't think what I'm going to say will come as any surprise to you, but I mean, I think that the big challenge that all Western armies now have is, broadly speaking, we're talking about professional armies that have become distanced from their society in terms of, collectively you represent a very small proportion of the population of Australia. On the other hand, of course, you represent something that is much admired within Australia. And again, that's true, I think, at the moment. Most Western armies stand in very high estimation in the eyes of their public. And it seems to be extraordinarily resilient to that. Even if there are scandals at individual and personal level, broadly speaking, the public absolutely is behind their armed forces. In the United States, this is clear. In the United Kingdom, it's clear. It's clear in Denmark, it's clear in Holland, it's clear in France. What is it that then goes wrong? Well, what is it goes wrong, of course, is that you become unusable. Because the notion that anybody should be killed or wounded, you become victims in the process, inadvertently or wrongly used by your political masters. That seems to me the big challenge. Because actually, the whole point about having you is you should be used. You're out of a job. There's further cuts coming down the line if you're not used. So, to put it in the point about, I think it's a challenge in Rupert Smith's argument, the utility of force, which he stresses the argument about the population being the field in which this is where war is going, and of course what he's imagining is where you're actually conducting the operation. But the population you've got to be as concerned with is your own population at home, and where are they? And the difficulty here is that the lack, it seems to me, and it's very hard for any national government to get its head around this, because you're being deployed largely in coalition operations, is the difficulty of getting a clear sense for your public about the use that you're fulfilling. The fact, what is it that you're delivering that actually supports Australian national interests? And that is ultimately, of course, not your responsibility. It's the responsibility of the government to do that. But without strategy, there can't be strategic communication, sorry. And without strategic communication, there can hardly be a public understanding. And I'm maybe speaking too much from a UK perspective, and you may feel the situation is better in Australia, but I don't sense that it's any different here from where it is on the other side of the world.
General.
Can I take that a little bit further here? We're talking about armies, navies and air forces learning lessons. What about governments learning lessons? To me, the experience was that government wants options. They don't know what they want. Therefore, these magic words, and I'm dismayed they're still in play, of flexibility, adaptability, versatility.
Yep.
What are they? What do they mean? But government does want options. But I don't think they fully understand the capabilities of the military, largely because of the coalition context that you're talking about. And I'll just make a particular point. You talked about success being redefined in Afghanistan. I'm not sure it was, because I'm not sure it was ever actually defined.
No, that's right.
So have government learned anything along the way?
Well, you're far more experienced in this than I am, but my sense is no. Are they likely to learn anything? No. Now, part of that, in a way, it's a different talk, but part of that is that strategy is, the policy for them is in the realm of contingency. What they don't want to do, you know, the democratically elected, I'm very struck how often you will hear a head of state refer to what he's doing and how he defines, and I'm talking he, and of course it just as well could be she, in terms of what the public expects, by which comes back to the question I was addressing. Now that doesn't in any attempt, in any sense, try to address what it is that should be done in the Australian national interest, and is much more subjective in terms of how it's defined. And absolutely, the danger of flexibility, agility, adaptability, all those ities that we seem to have to live with these days, the danger of that is precisely that it feeds into that desire of politicians not to be pinned down. What's the solution to that? Well, I think there needs to be a much more robust civil-military relationship. I mean, I think the real challenge that we have, and I've banged on about this often enough, but I think the real issue that we have is that we have a model of civil-military relations developed very largely to suit the peculiar circumstances of the United States in the 1950s, confronting a Cold War and an expanded United States military establishment at peacetime, with a real hesitation from old school American politicians who were concerned about having an overmighty US military within the United States mainland. And this notion of military subordination to civilian control produces something that is totally dysfunctional. Because what is the principal function of civil-military relations? The principal function of civil-military relations in a functioning and robust democracy, which clearly Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, to take the three countries that most focused on this afternoon, the reason for having a functioning civil-military relations system is to produce effective strategy. It's not to make sure that the Australian army doesn't stage a coup, because quite frankly, that's not your biggest danger right now. I don't think you're sitting here plotting, and I think the same's true in the United States. You are a subordinate instrument of a democracy, and you know that. But what you do want to do is be used in circumstances which are sensible. Now, can that be achieved without friction? No, of course it can't. But that's like much else in government. There is a determination to take the friction out of civil-military relations, instead of seeing the friction as essentially part of the creative process. Think of the barneys that went on in the two world wars between generals and politicians. And that was healthy. When do things go wrong? Well, ask the Wehrmacht. When the Führer says, generals moan afterwards, of course, about being told what to say. Do they stand up to him themselves? No, certainly not. 3 bags full, sir. Go off and do it. Much better to have a robust relationship of the Alan Brooke-Churchill variety, which doesn't impugn Churchill's ultimate authority, but does say, Prime Minister, I think you're wrong, and is prepared to say that without it threatening anybody. Now, that requires maturity in a politician, as well as maturity in a chief of staff. And I think the real challenge might be, and this of course is a familiar refrain, is that we tend to have politicians lacking in experience. Less true, I have to say, in some respects of Australia recently than of Britain. But I was reflecting on it as I was thinking about the Afghan elections coming up. It's very striking. You think of some of the leading candidates for the presidency. They're older than Karzai. I mean, Ashraf Ghani, Rasool, these are people who are now in their 70s or fast getting there. They would be regarded as over the hill by 2 decades, despite the wisdom and experience that might come with age. I'm not saying that either of them should necessarily be the ideal president, but those people are probably better likely to cope with the friction that is natural in civil-military relations, just as a prime minister will have to deal with friction in making education policy or health policy or any other area of policy. But we have become victims of our own presumption of military subordination to civilian control in a way that has really denied the political influence, and I don't mean that in any pejorative sense, with a small p, that all you guys have, and that you will certainly be experienced in having, in terms of how, and being honest about that and reflecting it. I'm not suggesting but you know what I mean. That that the advice you give has political weight just because of your professional competence. And so let's be honest about that.
Time for one more quick one. Charles?
Professor Charles Weller, I'm the Director of Force Development.
Thank you so much.
I was struck by, within your presentation, when you mentioned about the interwar years and both the United States and Germany being the ones who learned lessons, one through the pain of loss and the other through the pain of austerity. It casts my mind to a number of other armies who have learned lessons through pain. Is pain required to learn institutional lessons?
It's damn tight either, isn't it? I mean, you don't want to go through pain, but I think it's a very robust organisation that is capable of going through really hard lessons. I mean, every institution worth its salt these days will tear itself up from the roots every 5 years and say, are we going in the right direction? I think the challenge for an army is that armies do that. And of course the natural rotation of people coming into new jobs is they say, I want to examine the basis on which we're proceeding and question whether that's right. And certainly in my familiarity with the British Army, the danger of course is every new incumbent in every post wants to reinvent the wheel and it all goes back. And I end up now being too long in the tooth in this argument by saying you do need to remember you did try this in 1985, so sort of before this guy had ever been at Sandhurst, of course, and therefore I'm just dating myself by saying that. But there is a way in which the lack of institutional memory can become a determination to change. But does it produce radical change? Not really, because of course you all belong to a hierarchical profession where more than any other calling in democracies, there are many tiers of that hierarchy and an expectation in a command situation that you will do what you're told and that the hierarchy will operate. And I think the challenge must be to be able to do radical thinking without challenging the hierarchy. Some armed forces have done that. I mean, I was questioning in my own mind whether I remember this right, but in 78, 79, when I taught at Sandhurst, there was a Soviet Studies Research Centre which was run by Peter Vigor and Chris Donnelly, and was essentially kept going under the Sandhurst umbrella, so they could, because there was one enemy, it was possible to think about that one enemy in a coherent way. And Peter Vigor, I remember telling me, and I spoke to Chris Donnelly about it the other day, and I said, I haven't misremembered this, have I? And he said, no, it's absolutely right. That when they declared an item for debate, open for debate, it was openly debated across the professional military press and throughout the army. And at that point, every idea was up, and whatever your rank, you were entirely open to, you were encouraged to express it. And then a decision was taken. This is what we're doing. End of argument. But at that point of debate, it wasn't top down, it was a free-for-all in terms of how it was conducted. And we think of that army as very hierarchical, very centrally directed, and quite unimaginative. I'm very struck, and you will have had much more experience of this. If you visit, go to the Afghan army now and you speak to some of their corps commanders, some of who could have been got out of a waxworks museum, and some of whom actually are really pretty flexible and quite impressive. Where were they educated? Soviet military academies very often, and some of the good ones among them. They didn't all turn out as waxworks from Soviet military academies. Some of them did. So there was some capacity to think there. In the British case, there's always a reference to what happened in the 80s and the focus on the British Army on the Rhine on manoeuvre warfare, the setting up of the High Command and Staff Course at the end of the 1980s, and the role of Ginger Bagnall as, first of all, as the Corps Commander, and then latterly, of course, as Chief of the General Staff. And he created a group, and John Kisley, who was on that group, has told me not to exaggerate this story, but he, it included junior officers, including then Major John Kisley, or perhaps even perhaps he was captain, perhaps he was Ginger Bagnall's MA. I can't remember his MA. Anyway, his ADC. But he said he was certainly encouraged to give his view, and he said, when I said, I put it in these sort of terms, he said, steady on, steady on. He was still a general. He still sort of knuckled down when the time came. But point is that the ability to have a discussion freely without undermining command authority when command is necessary should be something, it seems to me, which an army should strive for if it's going to be creative in these circumstances. Difficult, but still doable. And very hard. I mean, you know, a lot of my best friends are generals, and some of them are very bright, but there's always a danger, begging the permission from the generals here present, that when you stick them too hard in the ribs, they still turn out to be generals.
Well, with that, I would like to invite General Singelman to thank you for your presentation this afternoon.
Sure. Thanks. It might not surprise anyone that Professor Strong's address today probably didn't raise any issues that shocked us. In fact, many observations were self-evident to us. And yet, I find myself, at least in my appointment, quite disturbed and concerned about the status of our army and our future outlook and the journey we're on. Why might I feel that way? And why might I be seeking to reflect more deeply upon the lessons of our past and a greater understanding of these things? Well, we all have a lot to be quite self-confident about. We did okay in the last decade of conflict. We certainly have a proven record of change and innovation. I mean, we've got General Lay in the room, who, when he was chief, with Adaptive Army and a range of other initiatives, hardening the network in the Army and onwards, in that preceding decade, and whilst deployed operationally, our Army has fundamentally restructured itself at every level, concurrent with those operational commitments and distinct from our coalition and alliance partners, who all became very focused on winning the war they had and changing their direction to focus on that, and now are presented almost universally with a problem of what do we do next now that the war is over. Our process of innovation and change continue. I'm thankful that we did so. That said, I remain concerned. Why might this be so? Well, first of all, I don't think the change and the lessons that we are often drawn to first reflect upon as being important are perhaps the most important ones that I'm concerned about today. The lessons within an army and learnt on the battlefield, I think we have reasonable mechanisms for that, and we've applied them reasonably well. But as perhaps General Lay was alluding to, at the strategic level, at the national level, I fear that we have a narrative of learning going on that is completely desynchronised from our population and what they're thinking. Our self-belief on what we need to do, what we should do, and why is not necessarily partnered with those that are actually elected to make the decisions of us. And so we find ourselves in a predicament where what we believe we need and why is often not what we receive and get directed to do. It illustrates to me the importance of those of us in uniform to reach upwards and to continuously engage in education to help others understand. I also think it's perhaps not a strong approach to wish upon a government or a democracy a behaviour that they have not managed to display since the Peloponnesian War. I'm not sure that's going to change. I think there will always be dissonance between what militaries want and think and what governments do. I think there'll never be perfect harmony in the framing of strategies or national choices. There'll always be short-termism in many of our elected officials. And those simply become the realities of which we have to work instead of the environments against which we should be fighting. An important thing that we must understand. You know, reputations have a funny way of dying on battlefields. I do remember personally being quite shocked at my interactions with the British Army in both southern Iraq and southern Afghanistan. Their reputation in my eyes prior to that was extremely high, and deservedly so. But what I saw on the ground, without implying any criticism of the individuals or their professionalism, was an army that in terms of equipment and in terms of tactics and approaches was disturbingly, at least in my eyes, out of touch with actually what was required, and seemed to be moving much more slowly in reacting to the challenges that were right in front of their noses than perhaps should have been the case. That the response back home from their national government and people in helping support them on those things was disturbingly unresponsive. And you had circumstances where even between coalition partners on the ground there was a reluctance to talk about the differences and the distinctions because they may have led to poor morale or concern amongst the forces. So are we so self-assured about the lessons we've learned, our understanding of what they mean for the choices we've made of the future, given that we should have some cause for positive reflection on what we've done over at least the last decade or two? I offer not. I offer we should be hungry to look for further change. I agree that there is a risk in being too self-assured about the deserved achievement that we've arrived at. The basis of my concern is reflected through some vignettes. We had a military history conference last year. I was perhaps surprised in a way I shouldn't have been that most of the audience were historians. There were very few army officers or practitioners of the operational art there to listen to what, at least in my opinion, was some outstanding presentations with some very pertinent and important insights that we all should have borne. I'm worried that as an army, for a lot of our people, anything prior to East Timor is ancient history, and there is very little evidence of a natural thirst and understanding for history and its true lessons currently resident across our force. I think it's more defined as vignettes or more romantic interpretations of periods or circumstances or battles that happen to be conveniently trotted out to justify a point instead of deeply understood and thought through. I reflect upon the current way in which we structure and approach warfighting. We're now an army and a force of JTFs, battle groups and combat teams, and we work very hard in our readying and ready years and when we force protection to tailor a force. We try to perfect its structure, we equip it as well as we can, we man it fully, and then when we deploy it, we sustain it in a way so that those levels of support are kept up as close to 100% as we're able to do. That is not a bad thing, by the way. But I do remember the army I joined in 1980. It was an army that was not perfectly formed. Rarely, if ever, deployed with all the stuff that they had. It was an army, just through survival, was used to trying to approach problems from a position of some disadvantage, but still striving for success. I wonder if our current environment of creating well-structured, close to perfectly equipped and manned forces is still creating a mindset that is able to deal with the difficulties of other types of battle or war, where perfect manning may not be delivered, perfect communications may not be guaranteed, perfect air cover and joint fires cover may not be approachable, perfect communications with commanders may not be the norm. And When do we train for these things? When do we expose our armies to these things? What are the lessons that we are perpetuating in our own people through our own collective training activities and intellectual analysis of our circumstances if we're using our current experiences as the baseline to illustrate those points? I am worried that we may be doing the wrong thing in that space. I reflect upon our most prominent army exercise at present, Hamel. On that exercise, and I'm a big supporter of Hamel, by the way, I'm disturbed that if we continue in its current format for much longer, we will be setting our army on a course to be a second-rate force after 2017. Why might I say something like that? Well, because Hamel has become an exercise that is focused on the delivery of competencies. It's a certification activity primarily. Largely a brigade starts at one end of the training area and moves to the other end, and it's seeking out an adversary that is invariably smaller than itself, less well equipped than itself, and it has to overcome the issue. When did we become an army where, as a natural course of training, we were always the major force in the situation on the ground, and the adversary was always the little guy? Do some of you remember the time of 20 years ago where we used to almost sneer at the Soviet forces? They were doctrinaire. Their exercises weren't like ours because they used to do box-ticking exercises that just looked at the competencies. And when they came against a mission command, flexible organisation like ours, we were always going to prevail because of our difference. Well, what is Hamel becoming now? I don't want to besmirch it too much, but it's quite doctrinaire, it's very focused on certification, and it always starts from a position of numerical and equipment advantage, where some of the biggest challenges for the commander are simply just to make all the pieces work together. And you look at the source of real innovation on the exercise battlefields that we have crafted and exposed our army to at present, and where do you find it? You find it in the adversary, in the op force, that is striving to succeed against the odds and doing the unpredictable in an attempt to prevail. What we need to do, and one of the key lessons we need to learn, is how do we take that experience that Op4 and Hamel can achieve each year and visit it upon our army. So the lessons we learn are the ones we expose our people to, and we become a genuine self-learning organisation because of the constructs and the environments we create around our people that are less focused on perfect forces and coordinating all the equipments that we have, and more about dealing with adversity and delivering on that agility and those other characteristics. Now, we all realise that from Namibia forward, there was hardly any strategic analyst, white paper or thoughtful individual that predicted any of the operational conflicts that we were involved in past that point. Now that's all right. That's perfectly understandable. What it tells me is that we need to remain an army that is trained for and prepared for the unexpected. That one of the greatest strengths of our army and our defence force is dealing with that uncertainty but still being within climber's reach of the challenges, and to position our force and our people into that sweet spot so that they can migrate to the need at the time. That they're not too perfectly formed. They're not too doctrinally or strategically perfect in what they're focused on. They understand that war is chaos and that the lessons will always be new at the time, and that those armies and forces that will prevail will be the ones that rapidly adapt, agile in the face of adversity, right, but are strong enough at their heart to cope with the initial contest as it opens in these conflicts. I believe for this reason that we need to find a way to think more deeply about our history and to have a deeper faith in what we learn from that. I am disturbed at how closely we have become intellectually entwined with our US counterparts. That is not a complaint on the alliance. I believe we have a stronger relationship with the US Army than we have with our own Air Force and Navy. I can justify that statement both physically and the number of exercises, attachments and postings and doctrinal efforts that we undertake annually with that organisation against the equivalents with our own Navy and our Air Force. If you were to reflect upon that, you end up with a disturbing observation. I'm concerned at the roller coaster ride we go on at how quickly we are prepared to adopt US views on what they're doing at the time. Hybrid warfare today, COIN, insurgency, there's a rapid flow of knowledge and points coming from the US, and the fault is ours in how rapidly we're prepared to adopt those things, how unquestionably some of our people are prepared to take them on, how ready we have been in the past to simply accept a lot of the jingoism of modern warfare that keeps being reinvented every decade in our own doctrine and concepts at the expense of plain English, and therefore the lack of ability to communicate clearly with non-uniform communities on which we closely depend. And so at this point now, and while I reinforce we have much to be thankful for and much to be proud of, and that we should not be too critical, there is almost an equal list of things we should be concerned about and striving to correct. And the burden falls to us. Now, the points that Professor Strawn has raised illustrate for me something that's very powerful. And that is that the lessons of our past and understanding what they mean are essential as we undertake our considerations of the future. Why on earth, General A, do we reinvent the basics every 4 or 5 years whenever we have a white paper? It's a rhetorical question, sir. Why do we raise an FSR that wants to do first principles analysis? It starts, why do we have an army? And things like that. If these lessons are so perpetual and important, why don't these teams continuously analyse these issues? Continuously feed our knowledge? So we don't have these gaps and periods and almost an epochal approach of cutting forces, reshaping forces or modifying forces to the politics of the time. History is one of the anchors that will keep us rational and consistent in that domain. History also keeps us honest with what we've learnt in the past and what rationally should be considered new into the future. Sir, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you more broadly for your wider contribution into the community across the world. Thank you for being one of that group of individuals who is prepared to be outspoken, something I would encourage all of us in uniform to be stronger with. And sir, on behalf of the Chief of the Army, David Morrison, who couldn't be here today, can I thank you on behalf of us all for helping us to better understand who we are, better appreciate some of the challenges about where we're about to go into the future, and more importantly to contributing to our intellectual depth and thoughts for the future as we undertake our own white paper and force structure review, and hopefully make some choices that are not as difficult as the ones your Army, the US Army and the Canadian Army have been forced to take over the last 3 years.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Right. Very appropriate. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.